My name is Prajakta Kuwalekar. I'm really sorry, first of all, for keeping you in the last 1 hour of this conference last day. And I'm speaking in English, not French. So I'm sorry about that. But so I work with the United Nations. And often we've found that when we go to tech conferences, and the United Nations has started going to tech conferences a lot more often now, we realize that not many people know that the UN has started some work on open source, right? And that comes from this whole idea that member states of the UN have now all started building digital products in their own countries, right? But those products fundamentally lack many principles upon which the UN functions, right? Like when the UN builds infrastructure, it thinks about interoperability in every sense of the word. So it might be digital infrastructure or non-digital infrastructure. But when countries and member states start building their own products, that aspect of open source, of openness, of transparency, of interoperability sort of gets missed. So, the topic here was digital sovereignty and why do we sort of, need to think about it in the sense of open source, right? Just wanted to quickly define what we mean by digital sovereignty. It's for member states of the UN to be in the driving seat of their digital transformation, all while building things that can be governed by the citizens, that are secure and that are interoperable as well, right? There are actually a lot of examples in EU where digital sovereignty has sort of taken a front seat in the conversations. I attended a session by the European Commission as well, and there also this got discussed. Like they have an OSPO now, right? And they're moving towards open source in a big way. There are countries like, you probably know X-Road, which is a Estonian digital public good, which literally runs the government and all of government services there, right? And that's also a digital public good that's being deployed by 4 more countries. So the idea behind this is for the global north to also talk to the global south. So whatever digital transformation work that has already happened in Europe or North America needs to also now push forward towards Africa, towards India. And in fact, India also does a lot of work in digital public goods, etc. But it also needs to move further to Asia, right? And that's the idea. Now, what kind of digital public goods do we have, right? And why digital public goods? Some of the problems, and you all know vendor lock-in, and you probably have heard it more than I can tell you more about it in this sort of talk. But because of the fact that a lot of services provided by the government are currently provided by private sector proprietary companies, there's a lot of vendor lock-in that gets created, and more importantly, the governance of these, because these are public goods, right? Yesterday's public goods were bridges and roads and highways and waterways. Today's public goods are going to be primarily digital, and therefore, it is important for them to be owned, governed, and be run by people of the country, not even the governments necessarily. So we want to sort of, in a way, challenge the, okay, I have lost this, but anyway, we want to challenge the status quo, not we, the UN wants to challenge that status quo a little bit through this idea of digital public goods, right? Digital public goods are open software, open content, open data, open AI, any of those digital solutions that are built using open source technology that attain sustainable development goals and do no harm by design. So by that we mean they have enough and more policies around technical documentation, community documentation, codes of conduct, and I will go a little bit more into detail there, but that's essentially what a digital public good is. And amazing. Okay, amazing. If I can't run tech as a product manager, I don't know what am I doing in my life. But this is not working, so I'm just going to sort of skip to, and sorry, but I can always email this deck to everyone later. But now coming to how digital public goods came about, and a little bit background on this. So in 2017, including Melinda Gates, Jack Ma, lots of private sector players, plus lots of member states of the UN realized that they needed a digital cooperation roadmap, right? Which was this UN's way of saying we now need technology to actually attain the sustainable development goals, otherwise we are kind of screwed, honestly. So for that reason, after that digital cooperation roadmap, they set up a digital public goods alliance, which is basically an alliance, and I would have liked to show you the logos, but the alliance basically has UNDP, UNICEF, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, WHO, we have WFP joining, ITU. So it basically has UN members and also member states. When I say UN members, I mean the various bodies of the UN, the member states, and now it also has a lot of support from donors and funders, right? This United Nations General Assembly, there was a $280 million of funding that was, yes, that's perfect, thank you so much. $250 million of funding that was 280 that now is available for digital public goods. This is a little bit about the roadmap for digital cooperation. If you can just, maybe even the next slide, so that I'll just stick to that. And all I have to do is this, okay, great. Right, so now coming to, what did this digital cooperation roadmap do and where we are right now with this, right? There had to be obviously standardization of what a digital public good means, right? And therefore the UN, and with like lots of public consultation for about over a year, including with Wikimedia Foundation, Linux Foundation, every name that you can think in open source was a part of the consultative process, including the private sector, but of course, private sector in a sense of private sector that actually enables open source and supports it or funds it, not the big tech necessarily. So all of these people came together to talk about what a digital public good looks like. And then these 9 indicators of the digital public good standard were laid out. This itself is an open standard, so any of you can as well, go take a look at it on GitHub, and if you have any sort of inputs to further take this up, we are more than happy to sort of collaborate with you. But essentially the first 3 indicators here, right, which talks about relevance to SDGs, use of approved open license, and this is where we, basically have this is where we also rely, so we, OSI approved licenses, we need Creative Commons licenses for open content. So this license is where we don't become the authority, we also work with sort of other catalogs and registries to enable that. The third one is clear ownership. What happens is a digital public good, once deployed by a country, can also have, downstream sort of, people working on it, people deploying it, people changing it. So you, at the end of it, for like a system like the United Nations, you need somebody to sort of say, I own this, right? So typically these products are owned by UNICEF, UNDP, etc. And then they build communities around these products in both the countries and in other countries where they work or where they want to deploy it to sort of contribute to these products. The 4th, 5th, 6th indicator are more technical. The 4th indicator ensures that there's no vendor lock-in essentially, because if there are any hard proprietary dependencies, that's basically something that this indicator will take care of. And we also, when you look at this standard, one thing I do want to mention is that we also make sure that product owners are not just, we're not saying yes or no to products, but we're also supporting them in becoming a digital public good, right? So a lot of UN funding goes towards that capacity building effort that goes with these product owners. 5th one is documentation, technical documentation, so that any layperson can, not layperson, but somebody with basic tech knowledge should be able to sort of deploy that product. That's what that indicator means. The 6th one is mechanism for extracting data, which is, if there is any non-PII data, there has to be an easy way for the downstream deployments to extract it. And 7th, 8th, 9th is more to do with, I think, the basic principles of the UN, which is, how do you make sure that the product is secure? How do you make sure privacy is accounted for? How do you make sure that it also abides by other laws and international conventions that the UN has, right? So this is also coming a little bit to life from this last indicator, which also is actually the fundamental principle behind the roadmap, which is do no harm by design, right? And by design, simply for a fact that in an open source project, the clear owner in this case can't really always determine what happens downstream, right? So do no harm by design again is laid out into 3, 9A, 9B, 9C, which talks about like protection against harassment, code of conduct, what are the kind of grievance redress mechanisms one should have, all of those things to just make sure that it's secure and users are sort of safeguarded. This is a very, it looks like a very easy process, but to become a digital public good, applying to the digital, to become a digital public good is very easy. But after the application is done, there is a 2-level technical review that happens by the Digital Public Goods Alliance, where the reviewers look at not just documentation, but also the spirit behind, do no harm by design, right? And looks into a lot of, and also there's a lot of back and forth between product owners and the reviewers. And this is also where we now want to start thinking about maturity, right? Like what do you define maturity for a product that's made for social good, which is a public good, and is built using open source, right? Because again, in situations like these, sometimes governance can be, and in maturity, governance is a key area. Sometimes it becomes hard to dictate what kind of governance should a product have, or mandate that this is the model for governance. So that's where we are also collecting a lot of feedback. So if any of you have any thoughts on maturity and governance for an open source project, especially if it's for societal good, then we would love your inputs on our GitHub repo. And then it enters a registry. Now I want to talk a little bit about this registry because I feel like that's what really helps the UN agencies to deploy some of these products. And we are now also seeing a lot of governments come into this. So imagine this like a Play Store, but for GovTech, right? Where you will find products that, do ID, payment systems, verification. So they could be building blocks. They could be basically various service-driven building blocks. Or they could also be, use case-driven end-to-end products and projects. So currently we have about, this is an old screenshot and I should have changed it, but currently we have about 140 plus digital public goods in this registry. And this registry is now being used by this alliance. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this alliance entails. So if you can, as you can see, the alliance was started by, UNDP, UNICEF, I can't get this wrong, NORAD, and Sierra Leone. And then later we also had other partners join in. So for example, GitHub has joined in, and what they are helping us with is discoverability of these digital public goods on GitHub platform. Because currently, if a government goes and looks for some product on GitHub, it's impossible for them to find these digital public goods. So things like those, we've done strategic partnerships with different players for deployment, funding, and discoverability of these DPGs, which is, extremely important. We, at the United Nations General Assembly or at the IMF World Bank meetings, every year this agenda gets discussed, and we're basically garnering more and more funding for this agenda. And the approach is very similar to the larger open source ecosystem, and that's why I probably put this slide, not very important, but essentially it has to be transparent and collaborative, and therefore an alliance, because typically when the UN gets involved, typically if it's just say UNDP or UNICEF doing something, it becomes very hard for other UN agencies to come on board. So this is kind of a, an alliance to get all the partners together, and everybody who works with the alliance is either either an employee or a consultant with the UN or with any of these partners that you earlier saw. So we're also more than happy to have more partners join us here and also, work with us for some of these strategic objectives. So these strategic objectives I mentioned earlier, right? There's a lot of work that has happened on this, on e-governance in the global north. And this needs to move to like low and middle income countries in Africa and Asia, especially because, acceleration towards the SDGs is of utmost importance. And also because, for sort of less mature, digitally less mature countries, it's going to be important for them to sort of level up very quickly and be a part of this whole digital inclusion journey. Now what has happened is this whole digital public goods concept has also sort of widened in the last 1 year. And now, mainly USAID has joined in. We're also talking to a few countries in Europe. France might come on board as a member. Germany is already a member. With all of that in mind, all these countries sort of needed to, let's say, put away their vested interests and get on the same page to say, hey, we know that, in global north, there's a lot of work that's happened on this. We now need to actually put money where our mouths have been and get together. So for that, they launched a DPG charter. And this DPG charter essentially means that we will move from digital public goods to digital public infrastructure, right? And digital public infrastructure is not entirely open source. Digital public infrastructure could have nodes that are proprietary because in many countries there's already, IBM does work, Microsoft does work. There's a lot of work that's already done which can't be undone for whatever reason because it has cost, it has other implications that, one cannot help. So how do you now think about, this is sort of first principles thinking or systems thinking on how do we get governments to, for example, a government is not, building cars, right? It's only building highways. So that's what digital public infrastructure essentially means, which is to focus on protocols, to focus on, all those sort of connectors, system integrators that could get this universe to work. And the call is obviously for countries to use digital public goods primarily and not proprietary solutions. But that, if you ask me personally, that's going to take a little bit of change management. And I think that we heard in the EU commissioners chat as well. So with that, I don't know how much time I have, but I think I'm out of time. So I'm going to, we're almost at the end of it, but I'm going to, if there are any questions, you can write to me at prajakta@digitalpublicgoods.net or support@digitalpublicgoods.net as well. And we hope that, we'll have some solutions from you or contributions to the standard itself. Because it's an open standard and we want to debate a lot with people. Thank you.
We have time for one or two questions if they are quick. Is there any?
Nothing on open hardware, just mostly software, AI, etc., but no hardware.
Not yet. I would say not yet, but this could be one of the things that, you contribute to on GitHub for just this question, right? Because these are the things that sort of move the needle on thinking about it. But okay, I'll come to why not open hardware, because we were also thinking strictly from the point of view of governments, and open hardware is not top of mind for governments, and that's probably why we don't have it. Yes.
One question about the sectors you were showing before. Does the UN prioritize certain sectors, or does it or it's just taking everyone on board, or how does it work?
So there isn't an official version of this, but just candidly, I think some of the sectors that are more fundamental are ID, national ID. Mostly in developing countries, people don't have a social security number or an ID, right? So ID is the beginning of any digital transformation. So ID is a big focus. Payment systems is a big focus as well, because payments enable, like financial inclusion enables a lot of other sort of things, and of course poverty. So these are three key areas. But I would say more or less 90% of the products that have applied to be a DPG have managed to clear this sustainable development goals or the sectors of the UN criteria, because let's face it, those goals are also fairly vague, and a lot of products can be a part of that. So yeah, but these are the three I would say are in focus right now.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.